Darren walked down Jefferson Avenue with his hoodie pulled over his head, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, the night cold against his skin. He saw the two officers standing near their patrol car ahead, their figures lit by the glow of the street lamp. He felt his chest tighten, his pulse quicken, and for a moment he wondered if he should turn back or cross the street. But their gaze had already locked onto him, their posture shifting as if readying. His mind flashed back to the stories his father told him, the warnings whispered in their living room late at night. He took a breath and quickened his pace, hoping to pass without a word. As Darren approached, one officer raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Hey, hold up a second," the officer called. Darren hesitated, his feet rooted in place, his thoughts racing. He could hear his mother's voice in his mind, telling him to stay calm, to be respectful, to survive. "Where you coming from?" the officer asked as he stepped closer, his partner standing back watching. "From my cousin's place," Darren answered quietly, his voice steady though his hands trembled inside his pockets. "Got any ID on you?" the officer asked, his tone neutral but his eyes scanning Darren carefully. Darren nodded and slowly pulled out his wallet, handing over his card without sudden movements. The officer looked at the ID, reading it under the light, then glanced at Darren again. "You live around here?" he asked. Darren nodded. "Yeah, just a couple blocks down." The officer's partner stepped forward now, his hand resting near his belt. "What's in the backpack?" he asked, his voice more pointed. Darren felt his breath hitch but kept his tone even. "Just my school stuff. A couple books. Some papers." The officer gestured for him to open it. Darren knelt down slowly, unzipping the bag, showing them the contents inside, feeling his face flush with quiet humiliation as they inspected his belongings, their silence loud in the empty street. After a long moment, the officer handed back his ID, nodding toward the road. "All right. Get home safe." Darren zipped his bag, picked it up, and started walking again, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He didn't look back, even though he could feel their eyes lingering until he turned the next corner. When he reached his block, the familiar sight of Mrs. Holloway's porch light filled him with a fragile relief. Her voice called softly from the doorway. "You all right, baby?" Darren forced a small smile, waving back, not trusting his voice to answer. He unlocked the door to their apartment, stepping inside to the warmth of his sister's laughter in the kitchen. Later that night, Darren sat at the kitchen table as his mother returned from her nursing shift, her scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic. She looked at him, noticing the quiet heaviness in his eyes. "Something happen?" she asked gently, setting down her bag. Darren hesitated, then told her about the officers, about the stop, about the backpack check. She listened, her face unreadable, then pulled him into a tight hug, whispering softly, "You did the right thing. I'm proud of you." Darren closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words, wondering why doing the right thing still felt so heavy in his chest, as if safety always came at the cost of something unseen. Rose's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it as she told the officer Malik had just walked in, nothing more, nothing suspicious. The officer hesitated, his eyes flicking between Rosa and Malik, trying to gauge the situation. Malik's heart raced, feeling the weight of every second that ticked by, wondering if this would escalate further. He wished he could speak, explain himself, but the words felt stuck, buried under the heavy weight of everything he couldn't say about his life, his fears, his struggles. The officer stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Malik's face, demanding to know why he had run, his tone colder now, like a warning. Malik could feel his stomach twist, his mind racing through countless scenarios, all of them ending in something worse than this. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. His throat tightened, his breath shallow. The officer's eyes were accusing, but there was also a hint of something else, something colder, something that made Malik question whether his answer would even matter. Rosa spoke again, her voice firm as she told the officer to step outside, that Malik wasn't going anywhere until they figured this out calmly. The officer shot her a glare, clearly not used to being challenged, but he stepped back. Outside, the police car's sirens still hummed in the distance, the sound lingering in the air, as if it was waiting for something to break, something to happen. Malik's mind raced. He wasn't just running from the officers, he realized, he was running from everything, from every moment in his life that made him feel small, invisible, and powerless. Inside the store, time seemed to slow. Rosa stood between Malik and the door, her stance protective but not confrontational. Malik could hear his pulse in his ears, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights above, and the distant sound of traffic outside. The officer's voice came through the door again, more insistent, asking for Malik's identification. He felt trapped, caught between the desire to stay safe and the knowledge that leaving this store might mean a confrontation that would scar him in ways he couldn't yet understand. The door swung open, and the officer stepped inside, his presence filling the small space. Rosa didn't flinch, but Malik could feel her tension. The officer's gaze locked onto Malik once more, his voice still sharp, demanding answers. But as he looked into Malik's eyes, something flickered in his expression, something that resembled doubt, as if he were starting to question whether this was really about the running at all. For a moment, Malik wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could make the officer see him, see that he wasn't a threat, just a kid trying to survive. The officer took a step closer, his voice softer now, but still laced with authority, asking Malik again why he ran. Malik finally managed to speak, his voice shaky but determined, explaining he was just trying to get home, that he had no reason to run. But the words felt hollow, like they weren't enough to bridge the gap between his fear and the officer's suspicion. He could see the officer processing, a moment of uncertainty crossing his face, but it quickly passed, replaced by that familiar wall of professionalism. Rosa stepped forward, her tone measured but firm, telling the officer that Malik had been harassed before by people who assumed the worst about him simply because of his skin, that this wasn't the first time he'd felt the cold judgment of the world. The officer didn't respond at first, his jaw clenched tight. Malik felt his hands begin to shake, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The officer's gaze softened, but only for a moment, and Malik wondered if that moment was enough to change anything. Outside, the police car's lights continued to flash, casting an eerie glow on the street. Malik could see the officer through the store's windows, still standing, still thinking. The words that hung in the air felt heavy, too heavy, like they carried the weight of every past encounter, every whispered judgment. Malik thought about his parents, how they'd warned him about situations like this, how they told him to always be careful, to always assume that no matter how hard he tried, he'd never be seen the way he truly was. Rosa's voice broke through his thoughts, her words gentle but firm as she told the officer that Malik was a good kid, just trying to make something of himself, that he didn't deserve to be treated like this. For a moment, Malik felt a rush of gratitude for Rosa, for standing up for him, for believing in him when the world around him seemed to be built on doubts and assumptions. But even as the words left her lips, Malik couldn't shake the fear that this moment, like so many others, would be forgotten once the sun came up, leaving him to face the consequences alone. The officer paused, his hands still resting near his belt, as if debating his next move. He looked back at Malik, his eyes searching, but it was as though he couldn't quite find the answers he was looking for. In that moment, Malik realized something he hadn't been able to admit before. He was always running, even when he wasn't. Running from fear, from judgment, from a world that refused to see him for who he was. He wondered how long he could keep running before it all caught up to him, before his own sense of self was lost in the chase. The officer took a step closer, his voice softer now, but still laced with authority, asking Malik again why he ran. Malik finally managed to speak, his voice shaky but determined, explaining he was just trying to get home, that he had no reason to run. But the words felt hollow, like they weren't enough to bridge the gap between his fear and the officer's suspicion. He could see the officer processing, a moment of uncertainty crossing his face, but it quickly passed, replaced by that familiar wall of professionalism. Rosa stepped forward, her tone measured but firm, telling the officer that Malik had been harassed before by people who assumed the worst about him simply because of his skin, that this wasn't the first time he'd felt the cold judgment of the world. The officer didn't respond at first, his jaw clenched tight. Malik felt his hands begin to shake, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The officer's gaze softened, but only for a moment, and Malik wondered if that moment was enough to change anything. Outside, the police car's lights continued to flash, casting an eerie glow on the street. Malik could see the officer through the store's windows, still standing, still thinking. The words that hung in the air felt heavy, too heavy, like they carried the weight of every past encounter, every whispered judgment. Malik thought about his parents, how they'd warned him about situations like this, how they told him to always be careful, to always assume that no matter how hard he tried, he'd never be seen the way he truly was. Rosa's voice broke through his thoughts, her words gentle but firm as she told the officer that Malik was a good kid, just trying to make something of himself, that he didn't deserve to be treated like this. For a moment, Malik felt a rush of gratitude for Rosa, for standing up for him, for believing in him when the world around him seemed to be built on doubts and assumptions. But even as the words left her lips, Malik couldn't shake the fear that this moment, like so many others, would be forgotten once the sun came up, leaving him to face the consequences alone. The officer paused, his hands still resting near his belt, as if debating his next move. He looked back at Malik, his eyes searching, but it was as though he couldn't quite find the answers he was looking for. In that moment, Malik realized something he hadn't been able to admit before. He was always running, even when he wasn't. Running from fear, from judgment, from a world that refused to see him for who he was. He wondered how long he could keep running before it all caught up to him, before his own sense of self was lost in the chase. The officer finally stepped back, his stance shifting as if he was weighing his options, looking at Malik, then back at Rosa, who remained steady in front of the door. The silence stretched long, filled with unspoken thoughts. Malik's breath steadied, but his heart still pounded. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, searching, not for guilt, but something else, perhaps the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. Was Malik just another kid caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was this something deeper, something ingrained in the way people like him were seen? Rosa's hand moved to her side, resting on the counter, her fingers drumming lightly, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. She looked at the officer, then back at Malik, her gaze soft but firm, telling him with her eyes that she was in this with him, that he didn't have to fight alone. Malik swallowed hard, a strange sense of calm washing over him, as if, for a moment, he could believe that maybe there was some hope left, that he wasn't as invisible as he had always felt. The officer sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the situation had finally caught up with him. He glanced at the squad car outside, his partner still waiting, probably ready for things to escalate, but there was a hesitation in the officer's movements now, a flicker of understanding. He wasn't just dealing with a suspect. He was dealing with a person, a kid, someone who was trying to survive in a world that often saw him as less than. The officer looked back at Malik, his voice quieter this time, asking him to step outside. Malik's feet felt heavy as he walked towards the door, every step a reminder of the weight he carried, not just from the run, but from every moment that led to this one. He wondered if his life would always feel like a series of moments where he had to explain himself, to justify his presence, his existence. Rosa didn't move, her presence like a shield around him as he stepped out onto the sidewalk, the night air cool against his skin, but the tension still clung to the air, thick and suffocating. The officer stood there for a long moment, his hands at his sides, not reaching for his radio or his cuffs. He was watching Malik, not as a suspect, but as a human being, a young man caught between the world's expectations and his own desire for peace. Malik felt the officer's eyes on him, searching for something, guilt, fear, resistance, but he didn't find it. Instead, there was just a kid trying to figure out how to make it through a night that could change everything, or nothing at all. The officer's gaze softened for a split second, but it wasn't enough to make Malik feel like everything was okay. He still felt exposed, like the weight of his skin and the judgment that came with it were too much to bear. Rosa stood beside him, her posture still strong, yet there was an exhaustion in her eyes. She knew how this went, how these moments never really ended, even when the immediate tension passed. Malik felt that too, the quiet resignation that hung in the air. Was this just another battle won, or was it part of a much larger war? The officer finally spoke, his voice low but steady, telling Malik to stay out of trouble, to avoid running again. It wasn't an apology, not even an acknowledgement of the fear Malik had felt. It was more like an order, a suggestion for how to avoid future conflict. Malik nodded, not trusting his voice to respond. He wasn't sure what to say anyway. He knew the world wasn't going to change overnight, that things would always be like this, a constant balancing act between survival and dignity. But he also knew, deep down, that he had no choice but to keep going. Rosa placed a hand on Malik's shoulder as they turned to walk away, her touch grounding him, reminding him he wasn't alone. As they moved down the street, the city's hum of life continued around them, the world seemingly indifferent to the weight of the moment they had just shared. Malik's mind raced, his thoughts tangled between anger and a strange sense of defeat. What would it take to make the world see him for who he truly was, to stop running, to stop fearing? Was he destined to always be seen as a threat, a shadow in a world that didn't understand him? As they walked, Rosa's voice cut through the silence, asking Malik if he was okay, if he needed to talk about what had just happened. Malik didn't know how to answer. What could he say that would make sense of everything, that would make this moment feel less real? He shook his head, trying to push the words out, but nothing came. The truth was, he wasn't okay, and he didn't know if he ever would be. Every step felt like a reminder that no matter how much he tried to control his own narrative, the world had already decided who he was. They reached a street corner, the neon lights flickering above them as the night deepened. Malik felt the tension slowly leave his body, replaced by an emptiness that he couldn't shake. He looked at Rosa, grateful for her presence, but the silence between them spoke volumes. There were no answers, no quick fixes. Just the heavy weight of everything unsaid, everything unresolved. As they stood there, the world continued to move around them, and Malik wondered if this was as good as it was going to get, just moments of peace amid the constant chaos of trying to exist in a world that didn't always want him. Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket, the sudden noise pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A text from his mother. It read, "Are you okay? I heard about what happened." His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he put the phone back in his pocket, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't ready to explain, not yet. Maybe he never would be. His mom had always warned him about situations like this. But how could he explain to her that the fear he felt wasn't just about the police, but about the world that never saw him? Rosa noticed the change in Malik's expression, the way his shoulders tensed at the sight of the message. She knew the burden that came with carrying stories like his, the weight of having to explain the unexplainable. "You don't have to tell her everything right now," Rosa said gently. Malik nodded, the words feeling like a small relief, but only a small one. He wished it were that easy. Wished he could just ignore the weight of his mother's worry, the constant fear that she'd always be afraid for him. But it was impossible to shake. They continued walking in silence, the rhythm of their steps mirroring the quiet unease that had settled in. Malik couldn't help but think about the officer's words, the way he had treated him, half sympathetic, half suspicious. It wasn't enough to change anything. No matter how many times he had these encounters, no matter how often he tried to explain himself, the reality of the world never changed. People saw what they wanted to see, and nothing he did would ever be enough to make them look past his skin. They reached a small diner, its windows glowing warmly in the cool night. Rosa suggested they grab a coffee, a simple distraction, a chance to breathe. Malik hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. What was the point of being out here, feeling this hollow, without trying to find some semblance of normal? They walked inside, the bell above the door jingling as they entered. The diner was quiet, save for a couple of people scattered around tables, absorbed in their own worlds. The waitress greeted them with a polite smile, offering them a seat by the window. Malik sat down, the tension of the night still lingering in his body, but it felt different now, less immediate. Rosa ordered a coffee for herself and a tea from Malik. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was until the cup was in front of him. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through him, and for the first time that evening, he let himself relax. The world outside still felt uncertain, but here, in this small, quiet corner of the city, he could almost believe things might be okay. As they sat in the diner, the quiet hum of conversation around them felt distant, almost surreal. Malik stared out the window, watching the streetlights flicker in the dark. It felt like the world outside was moving too fast, as if everything was happening at once, and he was just standing still, trying to catch his breath. Rosa broke the silence, her voice soft but insistent. "You know, Malik, this isn't your fault," she said. "You don't have to carry this weight alone." Malik glanced at her, searching her eyes for the truth in her words. Her words hit Malik harder than he expected. He had always carried this weight, this quiet responsibility to be stronger, better, more composed than anyone else in the room. Because if he didn't, there was always the fear that he would be seen as a threat. "I don't know how to stop carrying it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like if I stop, if I let go, I'll be lost." Rosa nodded, understanding the truth in his words. It was the unspoken truth they both shared, the weight of a life lived under constant scrutiny, always trying to prove your worth. The waitress returned with their drinks, breaking the tension for a moment. She smiled again, her eyes kind but distant, not really seeing them but doing her job nonetheless. Rosa took a sip of her coffee, her gaze still focused on Malik. She didn't need to say anything else. Her presence, the steady quiet of her companionship, was enough. Malik appreciated it more than he could express. He'd always been used to silence, but this felt different. This silence didn't hold judgment. It was simply a space where he could exist, without the weight of everyone else's expectations pressing down on him. Malik turned his attention back to the window, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It was a familiar sight, one he had seen countless times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight the city seemed more distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He felt like a stranger in his own life, a visitor in a place he was supposed to call home. Was this how it always was? This constant feeling of being disconnected, of trying to fit into a world that didn't understand you. He couldn't remember anymore. He only knew that he couldn't keep running. Rosa leaned back in her seat, her eyes studying Malik with a kind of quiet understanding. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said softly. "Life doesn't work like that. You don't have to know everything, just take it one step at a time." Malik felt a small sense of relief at her words, but also an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. He didn't know how to move forward, didn't know what the next step was. But maybe, for once, it was okay not to have it figured out. Maybe the key wasn't in the answers but in the act of continuing, of just moving forward. The warmth of the coffee seeped into Malik's hands, grounding him in the moment. The weight of the world didn't feel as heavy in this small diner, surrounded by the soft clink of cups and quiet chatter. Maybe this was the kind of peace he had been searching for, not a grand resolution, but these small moments, these brief escapes from the chaos. His phone buzzed again, another message from his mother. He hesitated but opened it. "Please call me, Malik. I'm worried." His heart tightened. He knew she was scared, but he couldn't bring himself to explain it all, not yet. Rosa watched him, her expression unreadable as she noticed the tension return to his face. She knew the struggle, the desire to protect loved ones, to shield them from the truth, to make them believe everything was fine. But that wasn't something Malik could do anymore. He had spent so much of his life pretending, hiding the weight of everything he carried. The truth was, no one really understood. Not the police, not his friends, not even his family. And maybe that was the hardest part of all, this feeling of isolation, of being misunderstood. He finally typed a response to his mother. "I'm fine, just tired. I'll talk to you later." He didn't know if it was a lie, or just an attempt at something resembling normal. He didn't know if he could tell her the truth without breaking down, without revealing how fragile he felt underneath it all. He placed the phone face down on the table, trying to focus on the warmth of the coffee, the stillness of the diner. But there was no escaping the weight of the world that followed him, the quiet dread that lurked in every corner of his mind. Rosa's voice brought him back to the present. "You know, we don't have to talk about everything all at once," she said, offering him a gentle smile. "You can take your time. Just know that I'm here for you, no matter what." Malik looked at her, feeling the sincerity in her words, and the way she cared for him without expecting anything in return. It was a rare thing, this kind of unconditional understanding. For a moment, he wondered if he could truly let someone else in, if he could trust someone enough to share the burden. The conversation drifted, eventually shifting to lighter topics, but the heaviness never fully left Malik. It lingered in the back of his mind, a quiet hum that reminded him of everything he was still running from. The world outside was still out of his control, still filled with people who would never see him the way he saw himself. But for tonight, in this diner, with Rosa by his side, he allowed himself to breathe. He allowed himself a small moment of peace, even if just for a little while. Malik's thoughts were interrupted by the waitress who returned to collect their empty cups. She smiled, offering a quiet, "Have a good night," before walking away. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a reminder of something he had almost forgotten. There were still moments of kindness in the world. He had become so used to the hardness, the tension, that these small, simple acts felt almost foreign. He glanced at Rosa, meeting her eyes for a second, silently thanking her for being that kind of presence in his life. As they left the diner, the cool night air greeted them like an old friend. The streets seemed emptier now, quieter, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Rosa's hand brushed against Malik's as they walked side by side. It was a brief touch, but it carried more weight than any words could. Malik didn't know what he had been expecting from this night, but it wasn't this. Wasn't this feeling of quiet companionship, of having someone who understood the space he occupied. For once, he didn't feel alone in the world. They walked in silence for a few moments, Malik's mind drifting back to the events earlier that day, the officer's face, the uncertainty of the moment. He wanted to believe that things could be different, that the world could be different, but the truth was that he wasn't sure. Was it possible for someone like him to ever feel safe, truly safe, in a world that didn't see him as just another person, but as a target? The question lingered in his mind like a weight he couldn't escape. Rosa broke the silence again, her voice soft but firm. "It's okay to feel what you're feeling," she said. "You don't have to always be strong. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." Malik didn't know how to respond. He had spent so many years trying to be the strong one, trying to be the rock for everyone else, that he didn't know what it felt like to lean on someone else. But in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it all alone. They reached a crosswalk, the light turning green. Malik stood still for a moment, his eyes focused on the street ahead. He could feel the weight of everything he had carried for so long, but he also felt something else, something that had been missing for a while: hope. Maybe it was a small thing, just a flicker of light in the dark, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, he felt like there might be a way forward, that the path ahead wasn't as impossible as he had once thought. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for tonight, that was enough. As they crossed the street, the weight of the night seemed to lift just a little. Malik had walked these same streets so many times, but tonight they felt different, softer somehow. He glanced at Rosa, walking beside him, and for the first time, he wasn't worried about what anyone might think. He wasn't worried about the world judging him, or fearing what could happen next. With her there, he felt a sense of security he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and for a moment, Malik let himself drift, letting the rhythm of their footsteps ground him in the present. He realized that Rosa wasn't just a source of comfort. She was a reminder of something he had almost lost: his own humanity. In a world that so often reduced him to stereotypes, to the fear others projected onto him, she saw him as more. She saw him as a person, with all the complexity, all the pain, and all the possibility that came with it. Rosa noticed the shift in Malik's posture, the way his shoulders had relaxed just a little. She wanted to ask him what was going through his mind, but she could sense that he wasn't quite ready to open up. That was okay, though. She knew that healing didn't happen overnight. It was the small steps, the quiet conversations, the moments of stillness that made the difference. She would be here, whenever he was ready. She didn't need to rush him. They reached a small park at the end of the block, and Malik hesitated for a moment. He didn't want the night to end, didn't want to go back to the harshness of the world waiting for him outside. Rosa seemed to read his mind. "We don't have to go anywhere yet," she said, her voice gentle. They sat on a bench, the city's distant hum fading into the background. It was just the two of them, in this quiet moment of peace, and for once, Malik didn't feel the need to escape. For the first time in a long while, Malik allowed himself to feel. The fear, the anger, the confusion, they were still there, but they no longer held the power they once did. In this moment, he wasn't defined by the expectations of others, or by the weight of a world that refused to see him. He was simply Malik, a person with a past, a future, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a place in this world where he truly belonged. The night was still young, and for once, he didn't feel alone.